History tells us a story about Hitler. That feels complete. A single man, absolute evil, total control, a villain so clear that the explanation seems finished the moment his name is spoken. And that's exactly the problem. Because the clearer the story becomes, the less we ask how it worked. We are taught to see Hitler as a break in history, an anomaly, a moment when something went wrong and then was corrected. But that version of the story is convenient, not just morally, intellectually. It allows us to believe that what happened in Germany was the result of one man's madness rather than a system that learned how to function without being questioned. It allows us to say, this was unique. This cannot happen again. And once we say that, we stop paying attention to the mechanics. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The danger of Hitler was never that he was incomprehensible. It was that he became too easy to explain. A single villain is comforting, because villains absorb responsibility. They make complex systems feel simple, and simplicity feels like understanding. This video is not about defending Hitler, and it is not about softening what he did. It's about something more unsettling. Why history needed him to look the way he does. Why the story we repeat is the one that allows us to stop asking the harder questions. Because if Hitler was history's exception, then history itself doesn't need to be examined. And if that's true, then we haven't learned from him at all. That's where this story really begins. One of the most persistent myths about Hitler is that he ruled Germany through absolute control, that he sat at the top of the system, issuing precise orders, directing every major decision, pulling every lever of the state with intention and clarity. It's an image that feels intuitive, and it's deeply misleading, because Hitler did not govern the German state the way we imagine modern power operates. He did not enjoy administration. He avoided paperwork. He disliked meetings that required detail. And he often delayed decisions until outcomes had already begun to form on their own. At first glance, this looks like incompetence or laziness, but it wasn't either. Clarity limits power. Precision creates accountability. And written instructions can be questioned, resisted, or ignored. Hitler understood something instinctively. A system that runs on ambiguity forces people to make choices for you. Instead of issuing clear commands, he allowed uncertainty to spread. Ministers, generals, and officials were rarely told exactly what to do. They were expected to anticipate, not what was legal, not what was ethical, but what they believed Hitler would approve of. This changed the nature of responsibility. Decisions no longer felt imposed from above. They felt self-initiated. If an action succeeded, it proved loyalty and competence. If it failed, blame dissolved into the bureaucracy. No single order to point to. No moment where refusal felt clean. This is where the myth of total control begins to fracture. Power in Nazi Germany did not flow downward through a strict chain of command. It radiated outward through uncertainty. Everyone competed to be closer to the image at the center. Everyone feared being seen as hesitant, cautious, or insufficiently committed. And so escalation became normal. Policies hardened not because they were demanded, but because they were rewarded. The system didn't ask, "Is this too far?" It asked, "Is this enough?" Historians often describe this dynamic as working towards the Führer, But that phrase sounds more orderly than it was. What it really meant was that Hitler did not need to monitor outcomes closely. He needed only one thing: to remain unquestionable. As long as his authority was absolute, the system corrected itself around him. This is why the idea of Hitler as an all-controlling mastermind is not just inaccurate, it's comforting, because it suggests that removing the man would have stopped the machine. But machines built on anticipation don't require constant input. They require belief. Belief that acting more aggressively will be rewarded. Belief that restraint is dangerous. Belief that hesitation signals disloyalty. And once those beliefs take hold, control becomes self-sustaining. Momentum replaces command. At that point, no one needs to be told what to do. The system moves, because stopping feels riskier than continuing. This is why focusing only on Hitler's personal control misses the deeper danger. If power can operate through uncertainty, through image, through the fear of falling out of alignment, then removing the figure at the top does not automatically dismantle the structure beneath him. And that raises a far more uncomfortable question. If Hitler wasn't controlling everything directly, then what was actually doing the work? In the next part, we'll look at the answer most histories overlook. Not policy, not bureaucracy, not even ideology, but image. At some point, Hitler stopped needing to tell people what to do, not because the system became efficient, but because the image took over. Power no longer traveled through orders. It traveled through expectation. People did not wait to be instructed. They acted in advance. They asked themselves a different question. Not, what am I allowed to do? But what would be seen as loyal? That shift matters, because once behavior is guided by image, control becomes invisible. Hitler rarely needed to appear. When he did not explain policy. He performed certainty. The speeches were not detailed. They were theatrical, simple, repetitive. They didn't tell people how to act. They told people who they were supposed to be. And identity is far more powerful than instruction. The image of Hitler was not built to persuade skeptics. It was built to stabilize belief. Calm when others were anxious. Decisive when others hesitated. Inevitable when outcomes were unclear. In a system already running on uncertainty, that image became an anchor. And anchors don't need to move. Once people believed the direction of history was settled, their role was no longer to question. It was to align. That alignment didn't require constant supervision. It required repetition. The same posture, the same framing, the same rituals. Over time, the image stopped feeling political. It felt normal. And what feels normal rarely feels dangerous. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because violence did not always arrive as an order. It arrived as an assumption, as something already understood, already expected. People escalated not because they were told to be brutal, but because restraint looked out of place. The image had created a standard, and falling short of that standard felt risky. This is the mistake history often makes. We imagine power as something loud, as commands shouted from above. But the most effective power does not need to speak often. It allows others to speak for it. By the time policies hardened, Hitler did not need to intervene. The image had already done the work. It told people what success looked like, what failure looked like, what loyalty looked like, and Once those definitions were internalized, control became self-sustaining. This is why focusing only on Hitler's decisions misses the deeper mechanism. The system did not wait for his hand. It moved in his direction. That is what made it dangerous. Not blind obedience, but eager alignment. In the next part, we need to ask a harder question. Not how Hitler used this image, but why history was willing to keep it intact afterward. Because the image did not collapse. When the regime did, it survived. And that survival has consequences. After the war, something subtle happened to the story of Hitler. It didn't disappear. It settled. The narrative hardened into a shape that felt morally clear and intellectually manageable. A single villain, a single source of catastrophe, a figure so extreme that everything else could be measured against him. This version of the story serves a purpose. It gives history a center of gravity, a place to put blame without asking too many questions about the structure around it. Because once responsibility is absorbed by one figure, the system that enabled him becomes secondary. And secondary things are easier to ignore. This is not about denying guilt. It's about noticing convenience. By treating Hitler as a historical rupture, a moment when something uniquely evil appeared, we protect ourselves from a more unsettling possibility. That what happened did not require a singular monster, only a set of conditions that allowed belief, obedience, and momentum to feel normal. History prefers clarity, especially moral clarity. Clear villains make clear lessons possible, and clear lessons are comforting. They allow societies to say, this was wrong, this was extreme, this was not us. But that comfort comes at a cost, because the clearer the villain becomes, the less visible the mechanisms that supported him. Bureaucracies fade into the background. Social pressures dissolve. Complicity becomes abstract. The story becomes cleaner than reality ever was. And that cleanliness is appealing. It allows post-war narratives to move forward without lingering too long on uncomfortable questions. Questions like, how did ordinary institutions adapt so quickly? Why did escalation feel rewarded rather than resisted? And how many decisions were made, not under threat, but under expectation? By focusing the entire weight of the past onto one figure, history simplifies itself. But simplification is not the same as understanding. This is why the image of Hitler has remained so fixed, not because it is accurate in every detail, but because it is useful. It provides a moral boundary, a line that says, beyond this point lies obvious evil, and anything short of that feels comparatively safe. That framing makes history easier to teach, easier to remember, easier to package, but it also trains us to look for danger, only when it announces itself loudly, only when it wears a recognizable face. The real risk of this story is not that it exaggerates Hitler, it's that it underestimates everything else. By treating him as an exception, we allow the systems that produced him to appear ordinary. By turning him into a symbol of absolute control, we avoid examining how much power can operate without direct command. And by freezing the image in place, we inherit a lesson that feels complete, even when it isn't. In the next part, we'll look at what this kind of storytelling costs us. Not in memory, but in repetition, Because when history becomes too simple, it doesn't warn us, it reassures us. And reassurance is not the same as safety. At some point, the story of Hitler stopped expanding. It didn't end dramatically. It didn't resolve itself. It simply hardened. The image remained. The explanations repeated, and the complexity began to disappear. This is what happens when a narrative becomes too stable. When a story is told the same way, often enough, it stops being questioned. Hitler becomes a symbol so fixed that it no longer needs context, and symbols, once settled, are rarely examined. The violence associated with his name becomes expected, almost automatic, not because it is understood, but because it feels already explained. This is where the story fractures, because the more we rely on a single figure to carry the weight of an entire historical disaster, the less visible everything else becomes. Institutions fade. Social pressures vanish. Ordinary decisions dissolve into the background. What remains is a silhouette, clear, recognizable, comfortingly contained. And once history reaches that point, something else happens. Silence enters the space where analysis should be. Questions feel unnecessary. Repetition replaces investigation. We stop asking how alignment formed, how escalation became normal, how restraint turned into risk, because the story already feels complete. This silence is not accidental. It's the result of a narrative that has done its job too well. By concentrating horror into one figure, history protects itself from having to look at its own mechanics. The past becomes something we point at, not something we examine. And over time, even that examination fades. The image remains, but its function changes. It no longer warns. It reassures. It tells us, this was obvious. This was extreme. This could not be mistaken for anything else. And that reassurance is dangerous, because real systems rarely announce themselves so clearly. They do not arrive fully formed. They do not present themselves as monsters. They grow quietly, through routines, through incentives, through the fear of standing out. But when history is remembered, only through symbols, those early stages disappear. They evaporate. All that remains is the final image, detached from the conditions that produced it. And once that happens, the past stops functioning as a warning. It becomes a story we already know. In the final part, we need to step back from Hitler entirely and ask a more difficult question, not about who he was, but about what it means when memory becomes authority. Because when that happens, history doesn't repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself quietly. And by the time it becomes visible again, the story already feels familiar. So this was never really a story about Hitler. He was the clearest example, but not the central lesson. The lesson is simpler and far more unsettling. Power does not always rely on force. It does not always announce itself through violence, and it does not always need constant direction. Sometimes, power survives by shaping memory, by deciding which version of the past feels complete enough to stop being questioned. Hitler did not just rule through ideology or fear. He ruled through alignment, through uncertainty that encouraged anticipation, through an image that rewarded movement in one direction, through a system that learned how to function without being told exactly what to do. And when that system collapsed, the image did not. It settled into history, cleaned, stabilized, turned into a warning sign so obvious that it no longer needed examination. That is the final danger. Because when memory hardens into authority, history stops teaching us how things happen and starts reassuring us that we would recognize it next time. We tell ourselves it would look extreme, it would feel obvious, it would announce itself clearly, but history rarely works that way. The most effective systems of power do not arrive fully formed. They begin as adjustments, as incentives, as habits that feel reasonable at the time. They spread not because people are forced, but because alignment feels safer than resistance. And when those systems are remembered only through their final symbols, their early stages disappear. That disappearance is not neutral. It trains us to look for danger only when it looks familiar, only when it wears the same face, uses the same language, repeats the same patterns. But power adapts. The tools change, the aesthetics change, the stories change. The logic does not. That is why this series was never about rehabilitating Hitler, and it was never about reducing his responsibility. It was about refusing the comfort of a story that feels finished, because finished stories do not warn us. They close us off. Unfinished ones keep us alert. So the question this video leaves you with is not about the past. It's about recognition. When power begins to operate quietly, through image, through expectation, through alignment rather than command, will we recognize it before it feels inevitable? Or will we wait until history gives it a face that feels easy to condemn? Hitler was not unique because he was monstrous. He was early in demonstrating how modern power can function without constant control. And that is why understanding the mechanism matters more than memorizing the symbol. This video ends here, but the framework does not, because history is not only a record of what happened, it is a record of which stories survived and which questions were allowed to fade. And the most important question history ever asks us is not what happened, it's what we stopped looking at. If this video stayed with you, not because it shocked you, but because it unsettled you, then it did its job. This channel isn't here to retell history the way it's usually told. It's here to ask why certain versions survive and why others quietly disappear. If you'd like to follow that kind of investigation, not just into figures we already fear, but into the stories that made them feel inevitable, then you may want to stay. New essays are released regularly. Each one takes a familiar name and treats it as a question, not a conclusion. You don't need to agree with every argument here. Skepticism is welcome. All we ask is that you keep looking when history feels most certain. If that sounds worthwhile, you'll find the next chapter here.